Ever wonder why that first sip of coffee hits you hardest? But then, by the end of the cup, you barely notice it.
It's like our bodies adapt, don't they?
Totally. Or how about that weird feeling like walking into a certain store? You get anxious even though nothing bad ever happened there.
Those everyday mysteries are fascinating.
They really are. So today we're diving deep into the hidden forces behind those everyday mysteries.
Exploring the roots of behavior itself.
Exactly.
That's right, we're going on a journey into the fascinating world of applied behavior analysis, or ABA.
ABA, all right.
It's all about understanding how behavior works and how we can apply that knowledge to make positive changes.
Okay, so ABA Chapter Chat is all about making these concepts clear and useful, right?
Absolutely, no need to get lost in jargon.
No jargon.
Exactly.
Where do we even begin with understanding behavior's origins?
Well, we start by recognizing that behavior doesn't just appear out of thin air.
Right. It doesn't just magically appear.
It has a foundation, a history rooted in two key areas, phylogeny and ontogeny.
Phylogeny. Ontogeny. Okay, those sound like words I haven't used since, well, maybe never.
They can be a mouthful.
Yeah. Can you break those down for us?
Absolutely. Phylogeny refers to the behavior we inherit through our genes, the stuff passed down through generations because it helped our ancestors survive.
Okay, so it's like our built-in survival guide.
Encoded in our DNA.
Wow.
Ontogeny, on the other hand, is about the learning that happens throughout our individual lives.
Okay.
Shaping our responses based on our unique experiences.
So it's like nature versus nurture for behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
We come pre-programmed with certain instincts, thanks to phylogeny, but then our individual experiences through ontogeny fine-tune those instincts.
That's a great way to put it. Now, let's start with the fascinating world of phylogenetic behavior, those behaviors essential for survival. A prime example is a reflex, like pulling your hand away from a hot stove.
Oh, man. Talk about a quick lesson in cause and effect.
Right.
You don't even think about it, your hand just jerks back. But phylogenetic behavior isn't just about reflexes, right?
You're right. There are also more complex, pre-programmed sequences of behavior called fixed action patterns, or FAPs. A classic example is that mother goose retrieving her egg that's rolled out of the nest. Even if you take the egg away mid-sequence, she'll continue those very specific movements as if it was still there.
Wait, so it's like she's on autopilot, completing the whole routine even when it no longer makes sense. That's both fascinating and a little bit funny to imagine.
It is rather amusing to picture, but it highlights the rigid nature of these innate patterns. Now, to be fair, there can be slight variations within those fixed action patterns, which we call modal action patterns, or MAPs.
So it's not like every goose in the world retrieves its eggs in the exact same way, right?
Exactly. Think about something like yawning. We all yawn in a similar way, but the duration and frequency can vary from person to person, maybe even depending on how tired we are.
Okay, that makes sense. So with MAPs, we're acknowledging that even these instinctual behaviors have some flexibility based on individual differences and environmental factors. So cool.
Now, let's delve into another intriguing type of phylogenetic behavior sequence. Reaction chains. Imagine a beautifully choreographed dance, but instead of dancers, it's the courtship ritual of the stickleback fish.
Ooh, fishy romance. Tell me more.
The male stickleback will initiate a zigzag dance, flashing his bright red belly. That triggers a specific response in the female, who then arches her back. Her posture then prompts the male to guide her to his nest, and so on. Each action is like a cue that sets off the next response in the chain.
Wow, it's like they're reading each other's body language, creating this intricate chain reaction of behavior. What happens if one of them messes up the steps? Does the whole courtship fall apart?
That's a key difference between FAPs and reaction chains. Remember those geese? They'd keep retrieving that imaginary egg no matter what. But with reaction chains, each step relies on the previous one being completed. If the female stickleback doesn't arch her back, the male won't guide her to the nest. The chain breaks down.
So it's less like a pre-recorded program and more like a live performance where the actors are riffing off each other in real time.
A great analogy. Now, let's circle back to reflexes for a moment because there's more to unpack there.
I'm all ears. It seems like even something as seemingly simple as a reflex can have hidden layers of complexity.
Exactly. Reflexes actually follow specific laws that govern their strength and timing, known as the laws of the reflex.
Okay, let's break down these laws.
The first law is the law of threshold, which means a stimulus needs to reach a certain intensity to trigger a response. A quiet whisper might not make you flinch, but a sudden car horn will. There's a minimum level of stimulation required.
So there's a threshold, a point where our body decides whether a stimulus is worth reacting to or not. Makes sense.
Yeah.
What about the strength of our reaction?
That's where the law of intensity magnitude comes in. The stronger the stimulus, the stronger the response. A light tap on your shoulder might get a little but a hard shove is going to get a much bigger reaction.
Okay, so stronger input equals stronger output, just like turning up the volume on a speaker. But what about the time it takes to react? Does that change too?
You bet it does. The law of latency states that the stronger the stimulus, the faster the response. If someone throws a baseball at your face, you'll blink a lot faster than if they just gently toss it to you.
Wow, so not only is the response stronger, it's also quicker. That's wild. Now, I've heard that these reflexes can change over time. Is that true?
You're right. One way reflexes change is through habituation. It's basically what happens when a reflex weakens or even disappears with repeated exposure to a stimulus.
Oh, like how I barely even register the sound of the train going by my apartment anymore. It used to jolt me awake, but now it's just background noise.
That's a perfect example. Your startle response to the train sound has gradually decreased as you've become habituated to it.
So habituation is like our body hitting the snooze button on certain stimuli, allowing us to focus on what's new or potentially important. Makes sense. We can't be freaking out over every little thing all the time.
Precisely. It's incredibly adaptive. Remember those people living near the volcano we mentioned earlier? They became habituated to the sounds of minor eruptions because, thankfully, those eruptions weren't posing an immediate threat.
That's a powerful example of how habituation helps us adapt to our surroundings. It's like our brains are constantly recalibrating, figuring out what deserves our attention and what we can safely tune out. But we've been talking a lot about these pre-programmed behaviors we inherit. What about the learning that happens throughout our individual lives, that whole ontogeny thing you mentioned?
Yes, let's shift gears and delve into the fascinating realm of ontogenetic behavior, where experience shapes our responses.
Sounds good to me. Let's get learning.
You know, it's amazing, like how much our early development, that phylogenetic stuff, really sets us up for all the complex learning we do later.
Yeah, it's like we're building on those primal instincts, right?
Exactly. It's this fascinating interplay of nature and nurture. And as we dive deeper into that nurture part, that ontogeny, we see how learning shapes us throughout our lives.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What are the key mechanisms driving this whole individual learning thing?
Well, one of the most powerful forces is respondent conditioning. You might know it as classical conditioning.
Ah, Pavlov.
Yes. Pavlov and his dogs. It's a classic example of learning by association.
Totally. So, like in Pavlov's experiments, the dogs learned to associate the bell with food,
Right.
even if there wasn't any food present.
Precisely. He demonstrated how a neutral stimulus, the bell, which didn't naturally make dogs drool, could become associated with a meaningful stimulus, food, which does.
It's wild how our brains can make those connections. Can you break down that process a bit more, like for our listeners who might not be totally familiar with how it works?
Of course. So first you have the unconditioned stimulus, or US. It naturally elicits a response. In Pavlov's case, the food was the US.
Right. The food automatically triggers drooling. No learning needed there.
Right. That drooling is the unconditioned response, or UR. Now, we introduce a neutral stimulus, the NS. Initially, it doesn't have any effect on the response. The bell was the NS in Pavlov's experiment.
Because, yeah, bells don't usually make dogs drool.
Right. And this is where the magic of respondent conditioning happens. We repeatedly pair that NS with the US. So every time the food appears, the bell rings beforehand.
So the dog's like, okay, every time I hear that bell, food's coming.
Exactly. With enough pairings, that bell, the NS, becomes a conditioned stimulus, or CS. Now it can trigger the response even without the food.
So the dog hears the bell and starts drooling, expecting food. But does that connection, last forever?
That's a great question. It brings us to extinction. Conditioned responses can fade away just like they're acquired.
How does that work? Do we just, hit delete on the learned association?
It's more like muting it. We repeatedly present the CS, the bell, without the US, the food.
So the dog keeps hearing the bell, but no feed shows up. Poor pup.
Right. With those repeated disappointments, the salivation, that conditioned response, weakens and might even disappear completely.
So the dog's like, all right, this bell is a liar. No more drooling for this trick.
Exactly. But here's where things get really interesting. Even after extinction, that conditioned response can sometimes make a surprise comeback. We call this spontaneous recovery.
Wait, so the dog might suddenly start drooling again at the bell, even though it hasn't been paired with food for a while. That's so weird.
It is. It suggests that extinction doesn't erase the association completely, just suppresses it.
Like it's hiding in the brain, waiting to pop up again.
Precisely. So respondent conditioning is more complex than just acquiring and extinguishing responses. We also have generalization and discrimination.
Oh, right. Those sound familiar.
Generalization is when a conditioned response is triggered by stimuli that are similar to the original CS.
So if Pavlov's dog drooled at a specific bell, it might drool at a similar sounding bell too, even if it's not the exact same one.
Exactly. It's like our brains are saying, well, this is close enough. Let's see if we get that same yummy outcome.
And from an evolutionary perspective, that makes sense. It's got to be helpful to be able to respond to variations in our environment.
Absolutely. Keeps us safe and adaptable.
But then what about the opposite? How do we learn to tell things apart and only react to specific things, not everything that kind of sort of resembles something we've learned about?
That's where discrimination comes in. We learn to respond differently to stimuli, even if they're similar.
So Pavlov's dog might drool at that one specific bell, but not at a chime, even though they both make a sound.
Exactly. Think about all the sounds we encounter every day. If we reacted to every single one, we'd be in a constant state of overwhelm.
Totally. Discrimination helps us filter out all that noise. We can focus on what's actually important.
Right. And then there's higher order conditioning. Have you ever noticed how brands pair their products with celebrities you like?
Oh, yeah. Like using my favorite actor to sell me car insurance.
Exactly. You might start associating positive feelings you have for that celebrity with the product. That's higher order conditioning. A neutral stimulus becomes a CS by being paired with an already established CS.
So I might crave a certain soda just because it was in a commercial with my favorite musician, even if the soda itself is nothing special.
That's right. It's like a chain reaction of associations.
Wow. So learning can go beyond direct experiences. It can be indirect too.
Exactly. Higher order conditioning creates these webs of associations that can influence our emotions and even our preferences.
It's like our brains are constantly making connections, even if we're not consciously aware of it.
Precisely. And speaking of powerful influences, did you know that respondent conditioning plays a big role in drug use, tolerance, and even overdose?
Really. That's a bit scary, but also really important to understand, especially for people in the addiction field.
Absolutely. Let's start with tolerance. When someone uses a drug repeatedly, their body starts to anticipate those effects, and it triggers physiological responses to counteract them, leading to tolerance.
It's like the body's trying to maintain balance, right?
That's right. And this is where respondent conditioning comes in. The environmental cues associated with drug use, certain people, places, even times of day, can become conditioned stimuli.
So those cues are like, hey, the drug's coming, get ready.
Exactly. Those cues trigger those compensatory responses even without the drug. That's why people in recovery might experience cravings just from being in a place where they used to use.
Wow, so their body's reacting even though the drug isn't actually there.
Right, and that's what makes resisting cravings so difficult. But it gets even more concerning when you consider overdoses.
Overdoses, how does that tie into all of this?
Well, imagine someone who always injects heroin in their bathroom. Their body learns to associate that location with the drug.
Okay, so their bathroom becomes a cue for their body to start defending itself against the heroin.
Exactly. This lets them handle higher doses than someone without those conditioned responses. But if they inject that same dose somewhere new,
Their body's not prepared. The full force of the drug hits them all at once.
exactly. And tragically, this can lead to an overdose, even if they've taken the same amount they usually do. The absence of those familiar cues can be fatal.
That's terrifying. It really shows how powerful respondent conditioning can be.
It highlights why understanding these principles is so crucial. It's not just about theory, it's about people's lives.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about reacting to things, these stimuli that trigger responses. But what about those behaviors we choose to do? Like, how do we learn from the consequences of our actions?
That brings us to operant conditioning. It's all about how rewards and punishments shape our behavior.
Okay, so it's less about reacting and more about, like, acting on the world and seeing what happens.
Exactly. It's about how those consequences make us more or less likely to repeat certain behaviors. B.F. Skinner was a pioneer in this area.
Oh, I remember learning about Skinner in school. He did all those experiments with pigeons, right?
He did. He showed how reinforcement and punishment could shape incredibly complex behaviors.
Reinforcement, punishment, those words get thrown around a lot. It'd be great to define them clearly.
Absolutely. So in ABA, reinforcement is any consequence that makes a behavior more likely to happen again.
Okay, so like a child cleans their room and they get to watch their favorite show. They're more likely to clean their room again because they know something good happens afterward.
Exactly. And there are two types. Positive reinforcement, which adds something desirable, and negative reinforcement, which removes something aversive.
So either way, the behavior increases.
Exactly. Now, punishment is any consequence that makes a behavior less likely to happen.
Okay, and there's positive punishment, adding something aversive, and negative punishment, removing something desirable.
You got it. Now, it's super important to remember with both reinforcement and punishment, it's not about being mean or harsh.
It's about teaching and guiding.
Exactly. We want to understand how to increase desired behaviors and decrease those that are problematic. And that's where things like shaping, chaining, and extinction come in. They build on those basic principles of reinforcement and punishment.
Those sound like powerful tools. What exactly is shaping?
It's a fantastic way to teach new behaviors, especially complex ones. We break the behavior down into smaller steps and reinforce each step along the way.
So instead of expecting someone to do the whole thing perfectly right away, we celebrate those little wins as they're learning.
Exactly. Imagine teaching a child to write their name. We wouldn't expect them to just write it perfectly from day one. We'd start by reinforcing them for, say, holding the pencil correctly, then for making the first letter, and so on.
It's like building a bridge to that new skill, one step at a time.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And once those individual skills are mastered, we can use chaining to link them together into a more complex sequence.
Chaining. Is it like creating a chain reaction of behaviors?
You could say that. Each behavior becomes the cue for the next one. It's like teaching a dance routine, step by step.
So back to that name writing example. Once the child can form each letter, we can chain those letters together so they can write their whole name.
Exactly. Now, just like in respondent conditioning, we can use extinction and operant conditioning to decrease behavior.
So if we want less of a certain behavior, we stop reinforcing it.
Precisely. Operant extinction is about withholding reinforcement for a previously reinforced behavior.
So if that child was getting a sticker for every letter they wrote, but we stopped giving stickers, they might be less motivated to practice writing.
Exactly. The behavior isn't paying off anymore. Now remember, we can see spontaneous recovery here too.
Right, so that name writing might pop up again even after we thought it was gone.
Exactly. We need to stay consistent with our reinforcement strategies. But knowing about shaping, chaining, and extinction gives us a great starting point.
This is amazing. So ABA really gives us a framework to understand and change behavior in a systematic way.
Absolutely. It's a toolbox full of evidence-based techniques that can be used in so many different settings.
So we've covered a ton of ground talking about these amazing forces that shape behavior.
Yeah, from those inborn reflexes, that phylogeny stuff, all the way to the complexities of learning through respondent and operant conditioning.
It's mind-blowing to think all these mechanisms are working together, influencing everything from our simple reactions to, like, our deepest emotions, our habits, all of it.
It really underscores the importance of understanding behavior from a scientific perspective, which is the core of applied behavior analysis, of course.
Speaking of ABA, I'm curious, how do these concepts play out in the real world?
That's the heart of ABA practice. It's not just theoretical, it's about applying that knowledge, creating meaningful change.
So it's like you've got all these tools in your toolbox, but knowing when and how to use each one, that's the real skill.
Exactly. It's where art meets science. We take these evidence-based principles and tailor them to each individual. Every person's unique.
Can you give us some concrete examples? How is ABA actually making a difference in people's lives?
Absolutely. Let's start with a common challenge. Teaching kids new skills. Remember that shoe tying example?
Yeah, breaking it down into those smaller steps.
That's shaping in action. Instead of getting frustrated when a child struggles, we reinforce their progress. Celebrate those little victories on the path to mastery.
It builds confidence, right? Makes learning fun.
Exactly. And it's not just shoe tying. Shaping works for so many things. Brushing teeth, writing, social skills. It empowers people to learn and grow.
I love that. Empowering people. Okay, how about a different setting, like a classroom? What if you've got a student who's constantly calling out answers, not raising their hand?
That's a tough one. It can be really disruptive.
Totally.
So an ABA pro might work with the teacher to create a plan that uses reinforcement and extinction together.
So reward the hand raising, but ignore those call-outs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're consistently reinforcing what you want to see while making those unwanted behaviors less likely.
Like you're rewiring their response patterns,
Yeah.
making it more likely they'll choose those positive behaviors.
Right. Okay, now let's jump to a clinical setting. Imagine a therapist working with someone who's terrified of spiders.
Phobias can be so tough. People avoid whole situations because of them.
Absolutely. This is where systematic desensitization comes in, a technique based on respondent conditioning.
So you'd gradually expose the person to spiders, right? Starting small, maybe a cartoon spider, then working up to real ones.
Exactly. And the key is you're pairing those spider-related stimuli with relaxation techniques. Over time, they learn to associate spiders with calmness, not fear.
Their brain's basically relearning how to react. That's amazing.
It is powerful, and that same approach can be used for all sorts of phobias and anxieties.
Wow. Okay, so these are just a few examples of how ABA principles are being put into practice. It's incredible to see this science of behavior actually making a difference.
It truly is. And ABA is always evolving. New research, new innovations, it never stops. There's so much potential.
I'm excited to see what the future holds for this field. It's been so enlightening to dive into these fundamental concepts with you.
The pleasure is all mine. It's a privilege to be part of this community.
And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into behavior. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and a new appreciation for the power of ABA.
Remember, behavior is a language. And by understanding its grammar, we can unlock amazing possibilities for growth and change.
Until next time on ABA Chapter Chat, keep those brains buzzing and keep exploring this incredible world of behavior analysis.